Hi, my name is Jonathan Roth, and this is Geopolitical Futures video. Welcome to the 2018 forecast video. We're very excited to talk about what's happened in 2017, go over some of the forecasts that we laid out in 2017, and then at the same time touch on what's happening in 2018. And I'm joined from Austin, Texas, by Jacob Shapiro. He's the Director of Analysis for GPF. Jacob, thank you so much for joining me. Before we get right down to it and talk a bit about what happened in 2017, I want to remind our viewers that they can pick up the 2018 forecast by going directly to the geopoliticalfutures.com website, and right there on the home page there's a link that you'll see. You can click on it and you can get a hold of this forecast. But let's review a little bit, Jacob. Let's talk about what happened in 2017 and start with the US, because obviously this is they're still running the show, at least this year, as it pertains to the globe. So one of the key points that you laid out in the 2017 forecast for the U.S., you said that U.S. foreign policy will shift towards nationalism, and this will change U.S. relationships throughout the world. Obviously, we saw Donald Trump assume the presidency. Why don't you lay out for us, for our viewers, what happened with that piece of the forecast?
Yes, I would say actually this is a continuation of a long-term trend. I think that some people will have a tendency to ascribe this just to the Trump administration. But the United States has been trying to pull back from the world for a while now. The Obama administration was certainly trying to do this in its own way and really fell short in a couple of ways because it kept getting dragged back into things. But we see this, especially in the Middle East, where the United States has tried to rely more on partners in the region to manage the conflicts rather than barging in and doing things itself. We've seen it in East Asia, where the United States has faced a North Korea that has crossed basically every red line the United States has set for it, and yet the United States is relying more on its strategic partnerships with Japan and with South Korea in order to manage that problem. And then we've also seen the United States push back against some of its European allies and begin to say, if you're going to be a part of NATO, you're supposed to have 2% spending in your budget for military stuff. And Obama said this before, but the Trump administration went out of its way to say it particularly loudly. So what you can see from all of this is that the United States, is very powerful, and I would say is the most powerful country in the world. But there are limits to that power. And as the United States matures, it is trying to find ways to manage different regions in the world without having to directly commit U.S. resources to all those regions. It's sort of a stop and go process, and the United States is trying to figure out the right levers it needs to use, but that's what it's doing across the world, trying to find those relationships and partners it can rely on rather than relying on its own troops. Interesting.
Well, I must say the 2017 forecast, I mean, you guys really nailed it as it pertained to the U.S. I think in just about every point there, you definitely nailed it. Let's move over to Europe right now. Very interesting point that you made back in 2017. You predicted the refugee crisis will continue, differences between European countries on how to deal with the crisis will continue, and border controls, already a fact of life, are likely to be extended. Why don't you unpack that for me in 2017, how it's played out, your prediction?
Well, it really played out exactly as we expected. The refugee crisis, the crisis is almost the wrong word for it, because when you look at the sheer numbers that have been let into Europe, it pales into previous influxes of refugees into Europe. But even these small numbers have been enough to throw Europe into disarray. Brexit, the previous year, was just one example of it, but what we're really beginning to see now is a split, I think, between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Now, it's dangerous to generalize, and I don't want to think of Western Europe and Eastern Europe as monolithic blocks. These different countries in these regions have different perspectives. But overall, we can see that Eastern European countries have been very strong about not wanting to let refugees into their countries, no matter what the EU has to say about it. And the EU has proved powerless to make those countries do what Brussels wants. At the same time, we saw that Angela Merkel's decision to let in refugees to Germany really backfired on her. And though she won elections this past year in Germany, she emerged out of that much weaker than she did before, in large part because of her policies on refugees. So this was really, there are a lot of different issues in Europe, from secession and nationalism and unemployment, but this refugee issue really has been one of the spark plugs to create problems between the individual nation states and the European Union, and the differences between what those individual states think their responsibilities are to refugees and what Brussels would like their responsibilities to be towards refugees.
Interesting. Well, look, I'll say again, when it came to Europe, your team, you definitely did a great job of predicting in 2017 what it would look like. And I want to encourage our viewers, click on the link, Just below this video to pick up the 2018 Geopolitical Futures forecasts. It's going to be just as interesting as what you're hearing here. Let's move to Russia. I think maybe the most interesting point that you made back at the beginning of 2017 was that Russia will be open to a certain degree of cooperation with the U.S. over fighting the Islamic State in Syria. Why don't you go in depth on that one, because you absolutely nailed that.
Well, I think that it hasn't been open cooperation. You know, we haven't seen Russia and the United States hold hands and sing Kumbaya by any means. But when you look at the actual actions on the ground by both sides, you see coordination. You see that the U.S. had its partners on the ground in Syria and in Iraq, and that it pushed those partners to attack the Islamic State. And you saw that Russia used its influence with its partners, particularly with the forces of Bashar al-Assad, to fight ISIS. And I think this actually goes away towards the reason why the Islamic State was defeated a little bit more quickly than we expected, because Russia and the United States were able to coordinate their activities on the ground so well. Now again, this does not mean that Russia-U.S. relations were repaired by any means, but I think overall we saw that both Russia and the United States prioritized the defeat of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and at least as a territorial entity, that came to pass. The Islamic State no longer governs its caliphate. It no longer governs its capital in Raqqa.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to get a little bit in depth here as to how your team took a look at an issue like that, and how do you reach the conclusions that you did in your forecast? Because I mean, really, when you boil it down, as you said, publicly, you know, there's no cooperation, but we look at what was happening on the ground between American units and the Russians and even the Syrian government, for instance. There was a lot of coordination going on. How does your team pick up these little details that a lot of people don't?
Look, this is the hardest thing to do in our job, which is that you have to put aside not just your own personal politics, although that is step one, but the second thing is that you really have to ignore everything that everyone is saying. You have to ignore all the rhetoric about Russia interfered in the election and Trump wants to get closer with Russia and all these other things. These are not the things that make up forecasts. When we look at forecasts, we look at what the interests are of the different countries involved. And for both Russia and the United States, having a jihadist, Sunni fundamentalist territorial entity in the heart of the Middle East was just not acceptable. It's for different reasons. The United States is trying to create a balance of power in the region. The United States was the country that messed up the balance of power by invading Iraq in 2003, and it's been trying to put it back together. But you know, the United States wants that balance of power so that it doesn't have to be there anymore and doesn't have to do all the direct control. For Russia, this is a lot closer to home. Russia has a significant Muslim population of its own. Russia doesn't want to see that ideology transported to Russia. Russia also has very complicated relationships with Iran and Turkey, both of which emerged, I would say, this past year as potential regional powers. So when you look at both the US and Russia, they may want different things at the end of the day for the region, but they actually share some interests in common. And once you can establish those interests, and once you can establish the capabilities of both sides, then you can begin to say, well, what is this going to look like?
Interesting. Okay, Jacob, I want to talk about what's going on in East Asia. This is a place in 2017 you made I thought way back when you first made it in 2017, it was the one that I kind of scratched my head a little bit. And that was that President Xi Jinping in China will solidify his dictatorship in 2017. And I thought to myself, how is he going to do that? You absolutely nailed that out of the park. And at the same time, the flip side of that, what's happened with China and North Korea, it's interesting there. Let's get into that. Give me your take first on Xi Jinping, what's happened there, and then on the flip side, what's happened with North Korea with your 2017 forecast and looking ahead to 2018.
Well, I agree with you. I think China was one of our best forecasts, but unfortunately on East Asia, we also had probably our worst forecast of the year, which was the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. So I'll talk about both of those. Let's start with China. The issue with China is not just that Xi Jinping was going to sort of enshrine himself as a dictator. I actually saw a few other analysts that were going that far. I think the thing that we really added to that was that this was not a sign of China's strength. This is a sign of China's weakness. Xi Jinping has had to impose that dictatorship because China's structural economic problems are just too big for Xi not to have every single toolkit at his disposal to try and solve them. And Xi spent most of his year clearing off different types of rivals and also using stimulus to buy social stability in the country for the year ahead so that he could come to power and hopefully use that power to rearrange things. And we have already seen since the 19th Party Congress that Xi Jinping has put his foot on the gas pedal. We've already seen that the corruption purges are increasing. We've seen that central government control over monetary policy is increasing and that they're finally trying to tackle some of these inefficiencies. So this goes back to the model of China. China becomes very successful, but that very success becomes China's own worst enemy, and then an emperor or a Chairman Mao or a Xi Jinping has to come together to try and hold it all together. I think long term that's going to be very difficult. But as you said, North Korea I think was our major mistake. We said that North Korea was actually not going to be that big of a deal this year, and that was certainly not a very good forecast. We realized fairly early on in the year that we were off about that, and we actually issued a correction in March that said, well, actually, not only is this going to be a very big deal, but we think the United States is going to attack North Korea. And that turned out to be an overcorrection. And we've done a lot of internal lessons learned about that, and I can say two things about that. The first thing is the first mistake that we made was we simply misjudged North Korea's capabilities. We did not see how far their technological progress had come, and therefore we didn't see that in 2017 they were going to cross a red line that the United States was going to have to respond to. The second mistake we made, though, when we forecast that there was going to be conflict, military conflict between the two sides, was we didn't anticipate just how much resistance South Korea would produce towards the idea of a U.S. preemptive strike on North Korea. Now, of course, South Korea would bear the brunt of the casualties in any kind of U.S.-North Korea conflict. We thought that South Korea would go along with that, but that was a misreading. South Korea has to protect itself more than anything else, and that's its primary imperative. So we enter 2018 thinking that we don't think there's going to be conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We don't think that the United States is going to attack North Korea. If it does, it'll probably be a fairly limited tactical strike. I think we move from here to think about what does East Asia look like with a North Korea that has nuclear weapons, and what does the U.S. alliance structure look like with nuclear weapons. This actually gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is the U.S. relying on regional partners, relying on the balance of power. It's one thing to say, yes, the U.S. should rely on its different partners. It's much more difficult in practice when you see that there's a major problem and a rogue pariah state is going to get nuclear weapons. The instinct of the United States is to charge in. So far, though, it has resisted, and I think part of the reason it has resisted is because it simply doesn't have the capability to knock out those nuclear weapons and to bring any kind of stability to the situation. So yes, on the one hand, we had a very good read on China, but on the other hand, not such a good read on North Korea. We're hopeful that this year ahead, we're going to do a little bit better on that.
Interesting. Okay, well, look, one final point that I want to make. In your 2017 forecast, you said something that is remarkable, especially in retrospect. You said when discussing long-term technological transformation, you said 2017 will be the beginning of a long decline in microchip-based industries that will not be reversible. And then this is the sentence that really struck me. You said these industries will be reduced to desperately looking for new and more dubious applications. Now look, George and I had a discussion, really a one-sided discussion, this is George's take, on Bitcoin and what's happening about on the cryptocurrency side of things a couple of weeks ago. I have my own feelings on it, but you guys definitely nail it on that dubious, the word dubious being in quotes here. Maybe unpack that idea for me a little bit.
Well, I think there's no better example of this than the iPhone 10. Like now they're going to charge you $1,000 for the iPhone 10, and it's not clear to me what's different about the iPhone 10 except it has a little bit of a nicer screen and there's some facial recognition technology. But this is really the point, right? Like there is no innovation from the microchip. You're refining the different uses that it can be used for. It becomes a little more sophisticated or user-friendly. But we don't yet see what that major technology is going to be. Actually, I wrote a piece recently for a partner of ours called Brain Bar, which is in Budapest. It's one of these sort of like the South by Southwest of Central Europe, if you will. And I made the case in that article that really geopolitical need is usually what drives technological development, not the other way around. So I think if you're trying to look at what that next revolutionary technology is going to be, you should look at what are the major problems that different countries are facing in the world and what are those countries throwing their resources at. It's not a coincidence that a lot of the technology that Americans use today was created out of the space program because the United States threw massive amounts of resources at putting a man on the moon, and that spun off all different kinds of unexpected technology. So is it going to be batteries? Is it going to be electromagnetic weapons because they're looking for some way to deal with a state like North Korea? You know, we get outside of my wheelhouse there. But when I try to think about what the major next technological revolution is going to be, it's going to be about what do countries need and what are countries trying to figure out the answers to. Because embedded in that, usually you will find what the next great technology is going to be.
Well, listen, great analysis. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about the 2018 forecast, which, as I say at the bottom of the just underneath here in the description, you can click on that. It'll take you to the geopoliticalfutures.com website, and you can grab a copy of the 2018 forecast for yourself. But Jacob, why don't you just maybe go into a little bit of detail just for our viewers, let them know what they're going to find in the 2018 forecast.
Yeah, well, just very briefly, I'll just say I think the two most unstable regions in the world right now are probably East Asia and the Middle East. The crisis on the Korean Peninsula has not yet been solved. The U.S. has withdrawn a little bit, and I think what you're going to see in East Asia is you are going to see the beginning of competition between China and Japan. We talked a little bit about Xi Jinping and the 19th Party Congress. And many people in the media have talked about what a success that was for China. Much less has been made of Abe's really remarkable political victory in Japan. He has really come back to power with a very, very powerful mandate. And I think you're going to begin to see Japan flex its muscles a lot more in the Pacific as it thinks about what it has to do if a United States security guarantee is not completely ironclad as it used to be. In the Middle East, we are in the post-Islamic State world, which actually makes the Middle East more volatile than less volatile. I think here what you're going to see is you're going to see Iran and Turkey are going to begin to clash and are going to begin to compete for influence in the region. That also means necessarily that you're going to see more disintegration in the Arab world. I'm particularly pessimistic about the year and years ahead for Saudi Arabia. In much of the rest of the world, though, I would think the trends that we've been tracking will continue. In Europe, I think we're going to continue to see secessionist movements, rise of nationalism, the EU struggling to make itself relevant at both the European level and at the global level. I think particularly we'll see conflict between Germany and Poland. I think that's going to be the real center of gravity of that particular issue this year. You'll see Russia on the fringes. I think Russia will actually be looking for cooperation. I think it's tired of sanctions and it really needs to rejoin the world. So it will be open to different compromises as long as it can maintain the myth of Russian power. And the United States will be pretty gridlocked. We've already seen gridlock in the United States has prevented the U.S. from doing much abroad. For all of Trump's talk of massive foreign policy changes, I don't detect much changes in his foreign policy from his predecessors. And I only expect that to continue. I expect the U.S. To continue to be bogged down in its own domestic political issues. I expect economic disparity in the U.S. to worsen. And I think we're also beginning to see the signs of a potential cyclical recession in the U.S. And when that comes, it will reverberate throughout the world. So that's just a little taste of what to look for in the 2018 forecast ahead.
Well, Jacob, I must say, between you and George and your analysts, I mean, you have the best intelligence experts in the world, and you do a fantastic job of putting together this forecast. I know that our viewers are going to want to get a copy of this. Again, just go to the link just below the video, click on it. It'll take you to the geopoliticalfutures.com website, and click on the graphic there that you'll see for the 2018 forecast. And get it for yourself and give it a great read, because there's a lot going on in the world, and there's a lot that's set to happen here over the next 12 months. Jacob, thank you so much for your time. Happy holidays, and look forward to speaking to you in 2018.
Happy holidays.